Chapter 334, Infiltration, 2. I propose for Waylon Rochefield to be exiled from Henler. A rough voice echoed inside of the hall. The owner of the voice was a dwarf who sat on the right side of the semicircular table. He had light gray hair, a long beard, and his face was filled with wrinkles. His bushy thick brows were currently locked into a tight frown as he glared at Waylon, who was standing in the middle of the hall. The more he looked at Waylon, the darker his face became. Raising his hand, he pointed at him and looked towards the other dwarfs sitting on the table. Because his incompetence, we now have a huge liability on our back. In fact, we may very well have lost the war. Spit flew from the dwarf's mouth as he spoke. Everyone in the hall could feel the anger in the dwarf's voice as he spoke. Leaning back, he threw a disdainful look towards Waylon. I'm already being generous enough by proposing his execution. After he finished speaking, the hall was enveloped in a brief moment of silence. However, the silence did not last for long, as it was soon broken by another dwarf. I concur with Giver. The dwarf was a female, and she too sat on the right side of the table. A couple of seats away from the dwarf that had just spoken, Giver. Nodding towards Giver, she continued. I believe that exiling him would be the best decision. I disagree. But before she could even formulate her sentence, she was promptly cut by someone. With bushy fiery red eyebrows, the dwarf had a sturdy and muscular build. Bang! Banging his fist on the table, he raised his voice. By exiling him, you're basically exempting him from all his crimes. What crimes? He did not commit any crime, Rander. Giver spoke up from the side. Turning his head to face Giver, the red-eyebrowed dwarf, Rander glared. His crime was his negligence. Had he been more attentive, we would never been under such a situation. He can't be blamed for the insiders. The dwarven lady from before spoke up. Although it was indeed his negligence that caused all this, we're also at fault here. 1 for trusting him, and 2 for being unable to realize that there was a spy among us. Humph. At her words, Rander's face sank. Crossing his back and leaning back on his chair, Rander shook his head. Naive. You're too naive. It's because of dwarves like you that we're currently suffering this much. What did you say? The dwarven lady stood up and also violently pounded at the table. Bang! Pointing at Rander, she shouted. I dare ye to say that again. See what will happen to ye. Oh, now I'm really interested. I want to see how rusty ye got ever since our last fight, Alga. Standing up, Rander looked at the dwarven lady, Alga, with a provoking look. You'd. Enough. Just as the exchange was about to heat up, a powerful voice shook the room, all forms of noise ceased. Soon, the attention of all of the individuals in the room focused on an elderly dwarf that sat in the middle of the hall. A look of respect and revere was present in the eyes of many of the dwarves present as they looked at the elderly dwarf seated at the table. Not minding the stares, the elderly dwarf looked at Rander and Alga. Let's nae argue amongst ourselves. Dinna forget why we're here. His aged voice smoothly entered the ears of each and everyone present, calming them down, or rather, completely suppressing their fighting spirit. Eventually, the 2 dwarves that were arguing, Rander and Alga, calmed down and sat down back on their seats. Fine. All right. Good. Nodding his head slightly, the elderly dwarf turned his attention towards Waylon, who was standing in the middle of the hall. Studying him for a couple of seconds, he soon opened his mouth. Waylon Rochefield, as ye have heard, there be many who wish for ye to either be exiled or punished for your negligence. The elderly dwarf interlocked his hands on the table as his calm voice drifted across the hall, reaching Waylon's ears. Let me ask ye, what do ye think we should do with you? The moment the elderly dwarf spoke, the eyes of many of the dwarves present opened widely. Was he seeking the opinion of the human they were supposed to put on trial? What was going on? Instantly the sound of murmurs rang across the hall as each dwarf looked at the elderly dwarf with growing confusion. Just what was he thinking? With a calm and composed face, Waylon looked at the elderly dwarf and bowed his head slightly. It is an honor to finally meet you, Metropolis Keeper, Journus Loss Front. Respect could be felt in Waylon's voice as he spoke. He knew exactly who the dwarf before him was. Journus Loss Front, also known as the Metropolis Keeper, the highest status a dwarf could get. Raising his head, Waylon looked at Journus in the eyes. Regarding your question. Are you asking me what sort of punishment I should receive for my mistake? That's correct. Journus flatly replied. Smiling, Waylon fearlessly looked at Journus and said. Then, I would like for you to give me a chance to redeem myself. The moment he spoke those words, heavy silence descended the hall. However, the silence did not last for long as it was soon broken by the sound of a table being heavily slapped. Bang! What nonsense is this? A dwarf stood up and shouted. He was none other than Randus. Staring at Waylon, Randus's face was completely red. Why you? He was so angry that he had trouble finding the right words to say. It was only after a couple of seconds that he managed to formulate a complete sentence. Redeem yourself. After what ye've ye done? Be ye sure you're nae trying to hinder us instead o' helping us? Randus calmed down. Gennis raised his hand towards Randus, gesturing for him to calm down. But later. Gennis shook his head and cut him off. Although Randus tried to protest, Gennis had long forgotten about him and focused his attention back on Waylon. His words had caught his interest. Redeem yourself? Elaborate more on that. With his eyes still locked with Gennis's, Waylon suddenly smiled. What if I told you that I have a way to win the war? Honler, 4th level, Utility Center. You want me to fix this? Malvol said as he held onto a pale green flute. His brows tightly knit as he analyzed the flute in his hand. On the outside the flute looked ordinary, in fact, there were a couple of cracks around it, signifying that it was damaged. But to Malvol, whose eyes had seen all types of artifacts, he knew that this was no ordinary flute. Turning around to face Ava, he asked. This is yours? Yes. Ava replied as she curiously looked around the place. As she looked around, she spoke. Rin said that if there was anyone that could fix it, it would be you. Taking his eyes away from the flute, Malvol raised his brow. He said that? Yes. I see. Malvol smirked before turning his attention back towards the flute. Did he also tell ye that bootlicking me doesn't work? He know this firsthand. No, he did not tell me this. Ava replied, scratching the side of her face. How peculiar. The more he stared at the flute, the more fascinated he became with it. It had to be noted that it took a lot to impress someone like him, one of the world's most skilled blacksmiths. The fact that the flute was enticing him so much was a testament to just how unique of an artifact it was. Tracing his finger across a large crack at the bottom of the flute, Malvol muttered. The damage seems to be pretty extensive. As he analyzed the flute, Malvol's brows progressively knit. That was because the flute seemed to be a lot more damaged than he had originally expected. In fact, because of the damage, the artifact seemed to have regressed in grade by quite a lot. Interesting. But the more challenging it looked, the more Malvol wanted to fix it. Not many knew this about him, but Malvol was a fanatic of artifacts. Especially when it came to fixing complex artifacts like this. By trying to fix it, he was going to see what sort of technique the crafter used to make it, and perhaps even learn a thing or two from it. After all, for someone to make a flute like this, they had to at least have a similar skill level to that of Malvol. Just the thought of it excited him. Turning his head to face Ava, Malvol put the flute on a nearby table. I won't promise anything, but I'll take a look at the flute. Whether I will be able to fix the flute or nay will be a discussion for later. Although he was busy with the war and all, he could definitely make time to play with the flute. Malvol then pointed towards a stool in the distance. For now, have a seat or go back. I will need a lot of time to fix this. Inferno, unknown location. Now, if I'm not wrong, I should do this. With a tight frown, I looked at a long complex code in front of me. My eyes darted around, trying to see if there was anything missing in the code. Gulp. Reaching my hand towards the right side of my waist, I put my hand inside of the pouch that the guard had given me and took out a potion which I immediately swallowed. The potion was a mana recovery potion, and it was one of the things that I had asked the elders to give to me whilst I was trying to deactivate the beacon. Although I was now C+ rank and my mana capacity had risen considerably, the Mask of Dolos, being an A-ranked artifact, still consumed an incredible amount of mana. This was understandable though. Unlike the mask Jomnuk used to disguise himself as me, the Mask of Dolos was unique as in, it completely changed the skeletal structure of my face, unlike the one Jomnuk wore. In order to avoid having Angus scan him, I pretended to throw a fit at Angus. Furthermore, since the results saw no changes in my skeletal structure, Angus did not see the need to scan Rin. That was a big mistake. That aside, the mana consumption of the mask was still too great for me. I could now sustain it for at least half a day, but compared to the 2-day time limit that I had said I could deactivate the beacon, it was not enough time. Hence why I asked them to bring me mana recovery potions. Still, I'm not sure if this is a good idea. Frowning, I put the empty potion to the side. Closing my eyes, I felt the mana inside of my body and shook my head slightly. The rate at which my mana was consuming was a lot faster than the mana that I was recovering due to the potion. As such, after deliberating over the matter for a bit, I decided to speed things up and get it done within a day. In reality, I could have done this in just a matter of minutes, but I was trying to buy time for Waylon to get his stuff sorted. After all, he was probably going through a rough time. D. Increasing the speed at which I was typing on the keyboard, I inwardly prayed that Waylon would complete his part of the plan before I could activate the beacon. As long as he managed to convince the elders of his plans, we would finally be able to deal a massive blow to the demons. Chapter 335, Infiltration, 3. Henneler, Elder Council. A deathly silence enveloped the hall. What did you just say? Jernus's solemn voice echoed across the hall. A terrifying pressure spread out from his small and aged body, completely enveloping the hall. Subjected to such pressure, Waylon merely frowned. Having been with Douglas for a long time, he was already used to the pressure. Although Jernus was indeed higher ranked than Douglas, at the end of the day, the dwarves weren't really a combat-oriented race. They were craftsmen, not warriors. They didn't possess the bloodlust or battle lore frontline fighters did, not to the same extent. The pressure wasn't anything that Waylon couldn't handle. Ha! Closing his eyes and breathing out, Waylon opened his eyes and stared directly at Jernus. I'll say it again. Give me a chance, and I will help you end this war. PFTT. Once Waylon's words faded, the dwarf with red eyebrows, Rander, burst out laughing. I can't believe this. What kind of nonsense is this? Slapping the table, Rander continued to laugh for a solid minute. It was only when he realized that everyone's attention was on him that he finally stopped laughing. Looking around, he asked with a deadpan look, what? Dinna ye guys also find his delusions funny? This be nae laughing matter, Rander. Jonas spoke gravely, the look on his face severe. Don't tell me you actually believe his words? Rander asked with an incredulous look. To him, it was clear to see that Waylon was merely spouting nonsense to save himself. Leaning his body forward, he looked towards the other dwarves present before pointing at Waylon. Stop the war? Bah, if he could done it, he would've done it afore. Why now? He's clearly just trying to save his ass. I'm sure you're all smart enough to understand this, right? Unexpectedly, Rander was met with silence. No one spoke up. The silence further enraged him. He glared at everyone present. How low have we fallen for you guys to not realize this, eh? In reality, everybody shared the same thoughts as Rander. However, unlike Rander, they didn't speak up because of Jonas. The solemnity clouding his face prevented them from speaking up. He had a grim aura surrounding him, one that seemed to suffocate the air itself. No one was as fearless as Rander in that situation. Fortunately for Rander, Jonas didn't seem to mind his words. The latter seemed too preoccupied with Waylon's actions. All of his attention seemed focused on the human before him. Staring at him for quite a while, he asked. How confident are you in your words? Very. Waylon flatly replied. Looking at the other dwarves present, he straightened his back. If you give me a chance, I'll do what I said I will do. Staring at Waylon's confident expression, Jonas's brows knit in thought. Although what Waylon said sounded absurd, his fearless expression planted a seed of doubt inside of the old dwarf's mind. What if he could actually do it? Or could he? Was he really just saying this to save his own ass? After thinking things through, Jonas doubted it. Although Waylon was going to be punished for his failure, it wasn't going to be something extreme like an execution. After all, although he was one of the main people responsible for the failure, they too were at fault for being negligent. But that was before, things were different now. Waylon escalated the situation with his words. By saying something like he could stop the war, he had aggravated the situation. If before he couldn't have been executed for a failure not entirely on him, he would be guaranteed death for failing in his mission after making such a grand claim. Waylon was betting on his life. The sheer gravity of Waylon's words and determination made Jonas think that he wasn't bluffing. No one would be stupid enough to worsen their crimes. Squinting, Jonas decided to see where this bet would take the future of the war. Ye got me interest. Tell me what your plan be. I apologize. But contrary to what Jonas expected, lowering his head, Waylon apologized. Seeing this, Jonas's face sank. Are you playing with me? Looking up, Waylon shook his head and glanced at all of the individuals seated in the hall. No, don't get me wrong. It's not that I don't want to tell you, but I just don't really think that it's appropriate. Why is that? Lifting his head, Waylon shrugged his shoulders and looked at the other dwarven elders present. Raising his brow, he indifferently answered. Isn't it already obvious why? It was then that it finally dawned on Jonas. The reason why Waylon was not saying anything was because he was afraid that a spy hid amongst one of the dwarves present. Jonas wasn't the only one who understood his words, as all of those present in the room showed a displeased expression. One dwarf, in particular, wasn't happy with his words as he raised his voice. What nonsense is this? You first say you can stop the war and then you insinuate that there might be a spy amongst us? Are you purposely trying to create a rift among the council? The dwarf was none other than Rander. His face was twisted with rage. Ever since the trial started, he seemed to have this sort of vendetta against Waylon. In fact, he wasn't the only one that thought in such a way, but unlike the rest, Rander was a lot more vocal at expressing his displeasure. Plus, the ones who kept quiet didn't want to annoy Jonas, someone whom they highly respected. I canna believe ye guys be even listening to him. Ye are a bunch of cowards. I understand how ye feel, Rander, but what if his words be right? What if he truly knows a way to stop the war? One of the dwarves seated finally spoke up and addressed Rander. Snapping his head in the dwarf's direction, Rander spat. Bah, how can he know when even we don't know? And why only now? Something ain't addin' up. I dinna and winna trust that human. You make a valuable point, Rander. Jonas chimed in, much to Rander's joy. Then. However, his next words caused Rander's face to sink completely. But, I'll still give him a chance to prove himself to us. Since Jomnuk has been kidnapped, we have nothing to lose. It's nae like we're going to let him do this unsupervised. Jonas turned his attention back towards Waylon. Under the witness everyone present, I grant ye the power to carry on with the plans ye have. If ye manage to successfully do as ye said, nay only will we clear ye your failure, but will also award ye with honor. His words were like a thunderclap to some of the elders present, especially Rander who blankly sat there with his mouth hung open. But, before anyone could even protest, Jonas raised his hand to stop them. I've already made up my mind. 'Tis shall be the final decision. You can't change my mind. Since he was the most powerful and respected person, the other dwarves present could do nothing but remain seated in quiet. Displeasure could be seen on their faces. Once the others calmed down, turning his attention back to Waylon, Jonas continued, Waylon, the only reason why I'm giving ye this chance be because Douglas. Me faith be nae with ye but with Douglas. If ye try anything funny, ye will nae be the only one that will suffer the consequences. Closing his eyes, Waylon nodded his head slightly. I understand. I will do my best to keep my word. That's all we wish for. Turning his head left and right, Jonas stood up. That is all for now. If Waylon needs something, try your best to help him. Understood. Similarly standing up, though displeased, the other dwarves acquiesced. While they were leaving, what the others did not know was that once the decision had been made, both Rander, the dwarf that seemed to have a vendetta against Waylon, and Waylon, smiled, in a way similar but all too different. Everything was going as planned. Gulp. Chugging another potion, my eyes remained transfixed on the panel in front of me. At this point, my eyes were bloodshot and my mana was all the way down to 10% of full capacity. Still, I had managed to last for another 8 hours. I've long since managed to infiltrate the system. Anytime I wanted, I could deactivate the beacon. It was only a matter of when. CLI clank. Suddenly, the door behind me opened up. The guard that brought me here came in. I'm here to relay a message. On with it. I replied with a disinterested look as my fingers continued to press on the keys of the keyboard. This was merely an act, though. The elders want to know how much longer will you take to deactivate the beacon. D. Turning my attention towards the right side where the surveillance system was, I opened my mouth and said in an unbothered tone, in about a minute. Since the elders were watching, there was no need for me to directly tell the guard. I could just address them from there. In a minute? The guard behind me cried out in surprise. MHM. Nodding slightly, my fingers started to move even faster. I think Waylon had enough time to convince the elders. My mana was at a level where any further drop would result in my identity being exposed. Anything lower than 10% would not be ideal. As such, I decided to end things at that moment. I just hoped Waylon had managed to convince the elders. Hoo. Taking a deep breath and staring at the panel in front of me, my fingers paused. This is it. I thought as I was one key away from deactivating the first beacon. The moment I pressed the key in front of me, chaos would ensue in Henneler. The barrier would weaken considerably. Furthermore, the time that it could remain standing would shorten greatly. It would bring about a massive change to the war, for better or worse. Perhaps, some might even die because of what I was about to do. Even then, I knew that it was a necessary step I needed to take in order to win the war. Lives will be lost, but it is necessary. Innocents might die, but there is no choice. I already had a lot of blood on my hands. Extending my hand, I finally pressed on the final key. D. Done. A second after, pressing onto the last key, a satisfied smile appeared on my face. Rumble. It was then that everything started to shake, almost as though I was at the center of a massive earthquake. Since I was already prepared for this, I was able to keep my footing. What the dash? Unfortunately, the same thing couldn't be said for the guard behind me. He fell face first on the ground. Ignoring him, placing my hand on the right side of the panel, I opened up the camera view and looked at what was happening outside. The moment I checked the panel, I witnessed one of the lights connected to the barrier slowly disappear. Once it happened, the color of the barrier became fainter and the ripples forming on its surface increased in wavelength. I could vividly see the panic spread among all the dwarves below. They were unable to make sense of what was happening. On the other hand, the demons started to attack with even more vigor. In a complete frenzy, they were trying their best to deplete the energy of the barrier. My God, you actually did it. Before I knew it, the guard was standing next to me, similarly looking at the panel that was displaying the happenings outside. Turning my head slightly, I replied. Of course I did it. Who do you think I am? Chapter 336, Infiltration, 4. Utility Center, 4th level. This is a lot more complicated than I first thought. Malval muttered under his breath as he studied the pale green flute in front of him. After completing his work for the day, he had spent most of his free time analyzing the flute. It was then that he realized that the flute was even more sophisticated than his original estimates. Just how did they manage to make the mana flow this way? Touching the shaft of the flute, a white hue emanated from his finger, entering the object. The moment mana circulated in the flute, it lit up and Malval was able to see thin vein lines inside. His eyes locked intensely on it, his gaze enraptured. I see. So, in order to create an oscillating sound, the mana is stored and released in short bursts that causes the frame of the flute to burst. Taking out a piece of paper, Malval started to sketch an image of the flute. Although there was technology that could perfectly capture an image of the flute, Malval was the type of dwarf who preferred to use a regular pen and paper. Sitting by the side, Ava curiously looked at Malval. He seemed to have completely forgotten her presence. The dwarf was utterly fascinated by the flute in front of him. Having stayed in the workshop for almost a day, she was understandably tired. More so than Malval, even. Hein and Leopold were still in the facility, but they were currently looking through the other sections, having a merry time. It was currently just her and Malval in the room. Excuse me. Malval turned, looking at Ava curiously. You're still here? A hint of surprise in his voice. Yes. You should probably go back, it will still take me a while before starting to fix this thing. That was a half-truth. Although it would indeed take him a while to fix the flute, in reality, Malval wanted to spend more time analyzing it. Therefore, he was planning on slowing down the rate at which he was going to fix the flute. It was selfish, but there was nothing in the world that could stop a dwarf from his craft. Consider this as a small payment for fixing the flute. Malvol mused as he put more mana into the flute. Typically, he would have never done this kind of job, but the situation at hand was an exception. The flute was just that intriguing. I can already tell you now, I won't be able to fully fix this thing immediately. Is that so? Ava dejectedly lowered her head. Her small frame looked pitiful at that moment. There was so much depending on the flute. Without it, her power would drop considerably. With the current ongoing war, Ava couldn't wait long for the flute to be fixed. She simply didn't have that much time. Staring at Malvol, she asked quietly, "How long do you think it will take?" Stroking his beard, Malvol put the flute down and pondered more to himself than Ava. Given that I still don't quite fully know the structure of the flute and the fact that I'm quite busy with other repairs, I would estimate that it would take me at least a year to fix this. A year? Ava's eyes widened in shock, her jaw nearly dropping to the ground. Malvol's reply was beyond her wildest imaginations. A year was far too long. She could have understood if it was just 1 week or a month, but 1 year was far too much for her. If she left the flute here to get fixed, then she wouldn't be able to participate in the war. It would be extremely detrimental, both to Ava and her team. Noticing the look of dejection on Ava's face, Malvol instantly understood her worries and reassured, "Don't worry. Although it will take me over a year to fix the flute, that doesn't mean you can't use it whilst I'm fixing it." Lifting her head up in surprise, Ava hurriedly asked, "Really? I can use the flute even when you're still repairing it?" "Yee." Malvol nodded. A slight smile played on his lips. "Whenever you need the flute, you can just come and take it. It's not like the flute will stop working once I'm fixing it." Malvol's words brought some much-needed relief to Ava. She put her hand on her chest and sighed in relief. "Okay, if it's like that then there is no trouble." Rumble. Before she could finish her words, the whole structure started to shake violently. What is going on? Both Malvol and Ava panicked. Holding onto the side of the table, the two of them tried to remain standing. Just what in the... With difficulty, while maintaining an uneasy footing, Malvol took out a small device from his dimensional space and switched it on. Soon, a holographic image appeared before him, depicting the situation outside. Oh, God Almighty! The moment Malvol witnessed what was happening outside, his jaw dropped in shock. The color of his face paled slightly. His behavior did not go unnoticed by Ava, who was standing next to him. What is going on? Leaning her body slightly, Ava took a peek at the holographic image. But at that very moment, when her eyes fell upon the image, Ava wished she had been in the dark. That was because the barrier protecting the city from the outside slowly became fainter. Outside the borders of the barriers were a wave of black demons that stretched all the way till they couldn't see. The scene looked horrifying. So, what you're saying is, you want us to help you infiltrate Henneler? A raspy voice sounded inside of a dark hall. That is correct. A cold and emotionless tone rung back. What are you trying to achieve by infiltrating Henneler? An aged female voice sounded. It belonged to none other than Durara, one of the elders of Inferno. At the moment, all of the elders were present, and their gazes remained transfixed at the hologram before them. Displayed on the hologram was an old man with dull gray eyes. He was a human. You do realize that we're currently in the middle of a war? We, by ourselves, face great difficulty infiltrating the place. What makes you think that we can help you enter? In fact, why do you think we would even consider helping you? Durara spat. Her voice was filled with annoyance due to the unreasonable demand. Unfazed by Durara's words, the old man in the hologram spoke up. I'm trying to look for a human. He's someone that the monolith is paying special attention to. Oh. And why should we care? Another Duergar spoke up. Wearing a monocle, the Duergar had thin white hair on top of his balding head. His name was Orion, and he was one of the elders of Inferno. Why should we care about helping you look for a human? You're not planning on asking us to do this for free, right? Orion's words were met with nods of approval from some of the other elders. It would take a lot of resources, including but not limited to the time and logistical constraints Inferno currently faced, to get someone to infiltrate Henneler. Moreover, they had nothing to gain from this. Unless there was a reward, the elders of Inferno did not see the need to approve of the request. Staring at the Duergars present in the hall from the holographic projection, the human, Mo Jinhao, squinted his eyes and spoke in a cold, dead tone devoid of the slightest trace of emotion. We can compromise then. Help us capture the human. In exchange, we will owe you one. Owe us one? Yes. What does this human look like? Orion inquired, his interest in the human piqued. To be owed a favor by such a large organization, the leader's interest were piqued. We're uncertain as of right now, but we have a tracking system on him. With it, you should be able to locate him. I see. Propping both elbows on the table, Orion interlocked his hands together. Taking a look at the other Duergars present in the hall, confirming their expressions, Orion spoke up, his voice and words on behalf of the council. All right, we'll give it a thought. We'll contact you later to let you know of our decision. I understand. Mo Jinhao replied with an indifferent tone. Moments after, his projection disappeared from the hall. Silence fell in the hall moments after. What do you think? Should we accept the offer? Orion asked. I don't really care, but... Durara was the first to speak up as she expressed her opinion. If they really can locate that person with a tracker, then things would be a lot easier for us. For them to owe us a favor in exchange for something like that doesn't like a bad deal at all. I concur. Another Druger spoke up. If it takes little to no effort, then I don't see why we shouldn't take the deal. Those humans have their uses. Resting his chin in his hands, Orion fell into deep thought. What the others were saying made sense. The reward was decent and the risk low, yet, as he thought about it, he couldn't quite get rid of this nagging feeling at the back of his head. For an organization as big as the Monolith, which, although weaker than Inferno, could still be considered a powerhouse in their own right, to have trouble finding this one guy, just how troublesome was he? He was afraid of perhaps inviting a storm inside of his own house. The situation was already too delicate for them. Inferno couldn't invite danger carelessly. I think we... Shh! But before he could address the matter, the door suddenly burst open. Clank! Clank! Entering the hall, a dwarf wearing a guard's uniform halted in his steps and straightened his back. Elders, Carl is here. The guard shouted, gathering the attention of all the elders present inside of the hall. Before long, an old Druger came into the room. Staring at the elders of Inferno present in the room, Carl had a fearless look on his face as he addressed them. Entering the hall, I found all the leaders of Inferno looking at me with fervent, eager expressions. Carl. You did not disappoint me. Durara was the first to speak. A large and pleased smile hung on her face. I always had faith in you. I guess she's not wrong. Out of all the elders present, Durara was the only one who believed I could deactivate the beacon. In fact, the thought most likely never crossed her mind, but that didn't matter to me. At that moment, I was eagerly waiting for my reward. That would allow me to enable the next step of my plans. Unaware of what I was thinking, Durara suddenly stood up and banged both of her hands on the table in front of her. Carl Callum, in light of recent events, you are now granted the position of senior advisor. On top of that, you will be granted this ring. Extending the palm of her hand, Durara revealed a black ring. The moment she revealed the ring, surprised expressions appeared on the elders present. The reason for their reaction lay in the significance of the ring's contents. It was not just any regular ring, but actually, a dimensional space filled with money, artifacts, and potions. Every elder present knew just how valuable the things inside of the ring were. They would definitely help me break through to the next level. Satisfied? Yeah. I'm very satisfied with the reward. That's good. Interlocking her fingers, she looked in my direction and eagerly asked, "So? When can you take the rest of the beacons down?" Lifting my head up and staring back at Durara, musing for a moment, I made up a lie. "Give me 2 months, and I'll be able to do it." Chapter 337, Setting the Pieces in Motion, 1. 2 months. Why? Since it takes you about 2 days for each beacon, shouldn't you be able to complete this in a month's time? Durara asked in wonder. She seemed confused. In response to her question, I shook my head in denial. That would only apply if I sorted all of Jomnuk's information. Unfortunately, I didn't. It will take a bit of time for that. I see. Orion nodded in acknowledgement from the side, understanding what I was trying to say. Orion, I don't think it matters much whether it will take 2 months or not. One of the elders spoke up, looking at Orion. He was Hutrud, the elder who'd previously doubted my capabilities. I still remembered him. With both hands interlocked together in a display of thought, Hutrud's eyes remained fixed on the table where a small projection of the outside appeared. He then pointed at the beacons outside of the walls. If we change our plans, as long as my estimate is right, once we manage to deactivate 8 of the 15 beacons, we can break the barrier completely. By then, the barrier will be too weak to withstand a full frontal assault. That's true. Durara muttered from the side, her head repeatedly nodding in agreement. Then, she turned to face me once more. I guess that's settled. Do your best in deactivating the rest of the beacons. As I've said before, you will be granted authority at the level of senior advisor. Do as you please. Thanks. I replied with a disinterested look. Since I was Carl, I had to act the part. And it soon became apparent that my acting wasn't too far off from the original Carl. The elders merely turned a blind eye to my blatant show of disrespect. Since you're here, let me hear about your opinion on a certain matter. It was then that Orion opened his mouth. Wait, are you planning on asking him about that matter? Opening her eyes wide, Durara looked at Orion with an incredulous look. Orion then glanced at her and the other elders present. Even if he's not an elder, it doesn't hurt to ask. The matter has little to no significance to us anyways. Orion shrugged. However, Orion wasn't being completely honest. I'm just asking for his opinion since he seems to have a bright head on his shoulders. Who knows, perhaps he can even come up with a good plan. He wanted another opinion because he couldn't get rid of a nagging feeling in the back of his head. Well, I think Orion makes a valid point, Durara. Hutrud spoke up. Tap, tap, tap. Tapping on the table with his small, chubby blue hand, he looked at Durara and the other Durgars present. Since he's smart enough to be able to find a way to deactivate the city's defensive system, he should be able to come up with reliable input regarding those humans. Humans? Standing by the side, the moment I heard Orion mention humans, my brows knit in consternation. Albeit, for but a single moment. Something's off. He has just been promoted to senior advisor, so I guess it's fine to tell him. Durara eventually relented and turned to glance at Orion, who looked straight at me. The moment our eyes met, a cold chill ran down my spine, but I kept my cool. Opening his mouth, Orion started to speak. All right, if anyone is against the decision of asking Carl for his opinion, please let me know. Once his words faded, a deathly silence permeated the hall. Though I wasn't sure what was happening, I listened attentively to what they were trying to say. From the looks of it, they want to ask me about my opinion on something that was somehow related to humans. As such, I just patiently waited for them to speak. Perhaps this was going to be important information. Fortunately, the wait did not last for long as no one spoke up. Nodding his head slightly, Orion glanced at me from the side. Since the others have agreed, I will now be asking you about a certain matter. Since about a month to 2 months ago, a human organization. It was then that Orion slowly started recounting to me what had happened moments prior to me entering. From how the monolith was trying to contact them in order to get their help in infiltrating Henneler to how they were apparently searching for someone, Orion told me everything. As expected of them. They've finally moved. The more I listened, the greater my indifference. This development, I expected it. Ever since I killed Xavier back in the forest and provoked Jinhao directly, I was sure that they wouldn't let go of the matter. In fact, I took this factor into account when making my plans, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. Originally, my plan was to bring it up to the elders once I rose to a high enough position, but it looks like that was no longer needed. And that is how it is. What do you think, Carl? Should we accept the offer or not? Disrupting me out of my thoughts was Orion's voice. Let me think. Scratching the side of my head, I pretended to think for a moment. As I was thinking, I could feel the eyes of every elder present, scanning me from top to bottom. Although I was confident in the mask, my heartbeat couldn't help but increase. Finally, raising my head, I looked at Orion and the other elders in the room. Accept it. Oh. My answer seemed to have been unexpected as both Orion and the elders showed a surprised expression. The first one to recover was Orion. He leaned forward, his eyes sparkling with interest. Tell me more, I'm interested. Why should we accept? Okay. Under everyone's expectant gazes, I started to speak. The reason why I believe that accepting the offer is ideal is because, aside from the favor that you receive from them, we can also use their presence to our advantage. Are you referring to the other humans? Hutrud finally spoke up. Compared to the last meeting, he had spoken considerably less. That is correct. Either way, nodding my head, I continued. As you probably know, there's a couple of powerful humans working together with the dwarves. What if we use the chance to create internal conflicts amongst them? Although there aren't many humans present, we could take advantage of the situation and create a scenario in which we frame the humans and pit them against the dwarves. Just like the dwarves could replicate demonic energy with the aid of an artifact, so could the Duergars accomplish the opposite. If they help the monolith members infiltrate the city and have them disguise themselves as non-contracted humans, the Duergars could have them go around killing random soldiers here and there. Of course, every time that would happen, they would need to do it in a way so that the others would realize humans were responsible for it. Slowly, as that continued, the Duergars could have the dwarf race and other races turn on the humans. Given Wayland's failure at saving Jomnuk, this time, he might face severe repercussions even if he was innocent. At that point, Wayland and Douglas would have no choice but to fight back, resulting in the dwarves suffering damage internally. On a long-term perspective, they would also lose all possibility of allying with the humans. Aside from that, doing this would, without a doubt, further damage the dwarves' morale. From the barrier slowly breaking down and everyone turning their backs on the humans, the morale of the dwarf race as a whole would decrease rapidly. They would be surrounded on all fronts. It would be a despairing situation. Pausing and glancing at everyone to make sure that they were following along what I was saying, I continued. Although it is hard and a lot of sacrifices will be made, if we manage to succeed in this operation, we might be able to completely destroy the dwarves before we can even remove the barrier. Moments after I finished speaking, the hall was once again enveloped in silence. Glancing towards each other, the elders showed pensive looks. Standing in the middle of the hall, I kept a straight face. I've already said what I needed to say. Now, all I have to do is wait for their answer. Although it looked like I was purposely screwing Waylon and the others, this was only on the surface. If there was one thing the elders didn't know, it was that I was the individual the monolith was looking for. All those words I just said were just me trying to convince Inferno to let Monolith in. My real goal was to lure them to me. The location of Inferno was unknown, and despite all of the dwarves' efforts in trying to find it, they couldn't. But what if Waylon and Douglas knew about the arrival of the Monolith members and quietly followed them from a distance? Since the tracker led to me, and I was in Inferno, their location would soon be exposed, and that was when the true fun would begin. Normally this wouldn't have been possible since the building was encircled by a tracking dampening system, however, things were different now. I now had a higher authority, and with the excuse of it interfering with my beacon deactivation, I could have a small area around me where the dampening system wouldn't work, meaning that the chip inside of my head would indeed work even in this highly secured place. Just thinking along those lines threatened to cause the edges of my lips to curl upwards. Slowly the pieces were falling together, setting up the perfect board. Fortunately, I was able to keep a steady face throughout the whole time the elders were discussing. At this point, they no longer cared about my input, but even then, each second they discussed felt agonizing. Their decision was going to dictate the future of my plans. And although I did have a backup plan, ideally, I wanted the first one to work. Fortunately, I did not have to wait for long. Sitting back on their seats, the elders nodded to each other, signaling that they had come up with a decision. With both hands on the table, Orion spoke up. It looks like we all agree about our next course of action. Lowering his head and staring at me, Orion's eyes squinted slightly. Since we've got nothing to lose with this plan, we have all agreed on executing it. Click. Clank. Closing the door behind me, I walked towards the center of the room where Jomnuk was strapped to a seat. Squinting, I glanced around, trying to make sure that the surveillance system was still down. Looks like they heeded my words. Prior to leaving, I had told the guard to not enter the place or I would kill them. Looks like my threat worked as nothing seemed to have been touched. Even the surveillance system. Ha! Plop! Slumping down on a chair, the mask came off my face and I finally relaxed a little. It was then that a voice rang from behind me. How was it? All right. Without even looking, I knew who the voice belonged to. Rummaging through my pockets, I threw a small ring in Angelica's direction. Here. What is it? Catching the ring, Angelica narrowed her eyes. As she looked at the ring, she quickly realized that it was a dimensional storage. Upon realizing this, she unceremoniously checked the contents of the ring. Her eyes shot wide open. Turning my head and seeing Angelica's shocked expression, I smiled. Those things are pretty useless to me, but I figured you might like them. Since we were in an organization controlled by those that signed contracts with demons, the rewards I received were things I could use, like the devil fruit. But just because I could use it didn't mean that Angelica couldn't. The things stored inside of the ring should definitely boost her strength, and given her current reaction, it seemed like I wasn't wrong. Knock, knock. But just as Angelica was looking through the contents of the ring in shock and elation, someone suddenly knocked on the door of the room. Chapter 338, Setting the Pieces in Motion, 2. Knock. The moment the door knocked, my head snapped in its direction. Staring at Angelica, who was also staring at the door, I put my finger on my mouth and urged her to hide. Knock. The door knocked once more. Taking the mask and putting it on, I hoarsely said, "Coming." Gulp. I quickly chugged onto a potion. Slowly, the mana inside of my body started recovering, albeit slowly. Glancing around the room to make sure that Angelica wasn't within sight, I extended my hand towards the right side of the wall. See, I clank. Upon touching the wall, the side of the wall lit up slightly and the door unlocked with a click. Who is it? Showing an annoyed look, I opened the door and looked at the one responsible for disturbing me. This time, I wasn't acting. I truly was annoyed. Hello. Standing opposite to me was a Duergar wearing a typical guard uniform. One that most guards wore, although they were a little bit too big for him. Is he a new guard? I wondered to myself. Glancing left and right, I noticed that he was someone that I had never seen before. My brows instantly knit. Who are you? Are you my newly assigned guard? No, sir. The Duergar replied, shaking his head. Then what is it? I'm here to drop something off. He briefly replied in a low tone. My eyes squinted at his words. Drop something? Something by DW. At the mention of DW, my eyes opened up slightly. Taking a step to the side, I gestured for the guard to come in. Get in. Don't disturb me while I'm working. Okay. The guard nodded his head and entered the room. Once the guard stepped into the room, subtly glancing towards my left and right, I closed the door. See, I clank. Upon closing the door, I turned to face the guard that had just arrived. Extending my hand, I asked, "Do you have it?" Yes. Taking something out from his dimensional space, the guard handed me a familiar black bracelet. The moment my eyes landed on the black bracelet, they instantly lit up. Thank you very much. Snatching the bracelet away from the guard, I quickly looked through its contents. Looks like everything is here. Making sure that nothing was missing, the smile on my face grew. That's right, the bracelet in my hand was in fact my bracelet. Because I knew that the Duergars would strip me of everything, and I wasn't too keen on ingesting the bracelet again, I asked Waylon and Douglas if there was a way to have the bracelet delivered to me. Fortunately, it seemed to be possible. Although the location of Inferno was hidden, they still had portals. With the aid of one of the upper echelon of the dwarfs, we managed to contact one of the spies put in Inferno and had him deliver the bracelet to me. The DW stood for Douglas and Waylon. It was a small keyword to indicate to me that they were the ones who sent the Duergar. If not for that, I would have been extremely wary, and perhaps have even resorted to extreme methods. That aside, this saved me a lot of trouble since I had carefully prepared a lot of things beforehand. Now that I had the bracelet with me, things would start progressing much more smoothly. In fact, I also had a few new things that I was sure the Duergars would absolutely love. Whilst I was looking through the bracelet, looking back towards the door, the guard spoke up. I have delivered the package, I should be leaving now. If I stay any longer our roles will be compromised. His tone sounded a bit worried. Yeah. Because I was too engrossed in checking my bracelet, I completely forgot about the guard's existence. He's got a point. Given Carl's character, for him to be talking to a guard for so long would make no sense. Since this whole place was under strict surveillance, everyone that came into contact with me would be put under heavy scrutiny. Especially since I was a very important person right now. This was why I quickly dismissed him. You can go. If you find anything strange, do report it to me. Yes. After my words, turning around, the guard headed for the door. But just as the guard was about to leave, recalling something, I spoke up. Wait a second. Yes? Halting his steps, the guard tilted his head in confusion. "Give me a second." I proceeded to take out multiple pieces of paper and a pen from my dimensional space. Then, holding onto the pen with my right hand, moving onto a desk, I quickly wrote something on each paper. Since I couldn't get in contact with anyone outside of Inferno, the only way I could communicate to the outside would be through the guard over here. Aside from warning Waylon and Douglas about the situation, I also wanted to give Small Snake and the others a heads up. Things were going to be a bit hectic soon, and they too will have a small role to play soon. Done. It didn't take long for me to write the message. Aside from a few words about how much I missed them and how my life without them was devastating, I wrote a few things regarding the plan. Putting the pen down, I smiled in satisfaction. Folding each paper neatly, I handed them to the guard. "Here, take this. When you have time, deliver these to the same people that gave you the bracelet. You don't have to worry about finding them, just hand them to the guy who gave you the bracelet and he should know what to do." Since Waylon knew who they were, he would have no trouble delivering them the letters. Plus, this could also give him an excuse to meet them and perhaps even teach them a thing or two. "I understand." Taking the pieces of paper, the guard put them away. After that, lowering his head slightly, he opened the door and finally left. See, I clank. Silence once again descended on the room. Angelica, who had been hiding the whole time, finally revealed herself. Since the only people that were aware that I worked with Angelica were Waylon, Douglas, I couldn't quite expose her identity just yet. "Have you sorted everything out?" she asked. Her tone sounded extremely annoyed. Turning my head in her direction, I nodded slightly.
"Yeah."
"We should no longer have any more distractions. Feel free to do whatever you want to do." In hindsight, her annoyance was understandable. Whenever she had to hide, she would always have to consume a lot of energy. I couldn't be blamed though. Not my fault I was popular. Okay. Unaware of what I was thinking, much to my fortune, closing her eyes, Angelica sat down on the ground and started to practice. Staring at her for a brief moment, I stretched my arms. Gotta get to work as well. Time waited for no one, and each second I lazed around, the greater the danger the city would be in. As such, after a while, turning around I sighed and walked back towards the panel. Let's see if Jomnoop kept his word. Tapping on my bracelet, I took out a small squared metallic box. At the side of the box was a small hole that was about the size of a finger. Without hesitation, I put my finger on the hole. Schwa! Right as my finger entered the hole, the box lit up and a holographic projection soon appeared next to me. Squinting, I looked at the projection next to me. Moving my hand across the projection, my brows furrowed tightly. This is a lot more complicated than I thought, at least he's kept his words. Projected in front of me were the instructions on how to disable the second beacon. However, much to my surprise, the instructions were completely different from the first beacon. In fact, they weren't similar in the slightest. I get that you did this to make it harder for the Durgars to compromise the defensive system, but why am I the one that needs to do all the work? I grumbled to myself. Although I was grumbling, my eyes never stopped studying the projections in front of me. In order to buy me more time, and prove my worth, I needed to deactivate a couple more beacons. My goal was simple. Just when things looked to be on the Durgar side, that'd be the moment I would finally make a move. Lock, research facilities. Shum. A terrifying flame completely engulfed a white room, enveloping it like a curtain. The bright and ferocious flame was so hot that black spots started forming on the glass that allowed one to oversee the insides of the room. The fire curtain spread around the room at incredible speeds, till finally, it completely enveloped the room. As the fire spread, if one looked closely, a bright light shone in the middle of the room. It was so bright that it even outshone the light coming from the fire. The light within the brilliant flame soon became increasingly clear as time passed and the flame lost some of its powers. Finally, the flame weakened completely and a small red card appeared in the middle of the room. Clamped by two large metallic arms, complicated runes and engravings appeared in the middle of the card. Once the flame completely died down, only smoke could be seen in the room. But it wasn't long before that also disappeared as the ventilation system quickly got rid of it too. Experiment log number 11286. Mana lingering in room, 30%. A metallic voice suddenly sounded from above. With both hands pressing on the windowsill, a beautiful girl looked at the scene within the room with astonishment. 30%? I did it, didn't I? An incredulous and almost relieved look appeared on Melissa's face as she stared at the card in the middle of the room. She couldn't believe it. After working on the project for over a year now, she had finally managed to get some results. She had finally managed to reduce the efficiency loss to 30%. Although it sounded like a lot, she went from 49% around a year ago all the way to 30% in just a year. That was a massive improvement on a system that she had to develop all by herself. Furthermore, the value wasn't just any value. The value signified that she could now commercialize the product. Soon, money would start endlessly coming into her pockets. Kakik. Just the thought made her chuckle like a deranged person. Standing next to Melissa, with both hands on her mouth, her assistant muttered. Melissa? We did it, didn't we? Who is we? Melissa sharply said, no longer laughing. Pointed at herself, she corrected Rosie. It's me who did. There is no we. I didn't mean it that way. Rosie quickly apologized. It was true. Melissa was the one that did all the work. All she did was watch from the side and help her clean up the room. Stroking her small delicate chin, Rosie took her eyes away from the room and softly said. Technically speaking, if you count the other person in the group, it could count as we. Unfortunately for Rosie, Melissa heard it all. She then looked at her in disgust. Him? He did nothing. I was the one that did all the work. He can die for all I care. But isn't he already dead? Being the one that was responsible for cleaning up after Melissa's mess, she knew who the other partner was. Of course, Melissa made her sign a contract in order to keep her mouth shut. How can he die when he's already dead? She joked. But contrary to the reaction she expected, once she looked at Melissa, she realized that her face was completely stiff. Melissa? Hearing Rosie's words, Melissa's brow twitched. She forgot that only she and Amanda knew that Ren was still alive. Turning around, she walked towards a nearby desk. Her next words confused Rosie to no end. You're right, Rosie. I'd be very surprised if he was still alive. So surprised that I might end up killing him again, of course, by accident. Chapter 339, Setting the Pieces in Motion, 3. That took way too long. I muttered wearily, taking my eyes away from the panel in front of me. It has been about a week ever since I infiltrated the place, and so far, everything was progressing smoothly. Well, sort of. The deactivation of the second beacon took a lot longer than my initial expectations. Compared to the first beacon, the process was a lot different. The whole process was coded in a completely different manner compared to the first beacon, making it almost impossible for me to complete it quickly. Any wrong step and I would end up locking the whole system. Furthermore, the panel I was currently using was less advanced than the one I previously used when deactivating the first beacon. With those factors added together, the whole process took a lot longer than originally anticipated. Fortunately, using the excuse that Jomnuk's memories were too jumbled up and that I needed to reorganize them properly, I managed to placate some of the impatient elders. It wasn't easy, but given my previous performance, they let it slide. It had to be noted that they were all individuals whose minds were corrupted by demonic energy, so the fact that I managed to calm them down was a miracle in itself. "Are you done?" A cold voice reached my ears. It was Angelica.
Yeah.
"I'm pretty much done." Before I knew it, Angelica was standing next to me, looking at the panel in confusion. Seeing the confusion on her face as she looked at the panel, I shook my head at her. "Don't bother trying to understand it, even I don't know what I did. I won't be able to explain even if you asked. I only did what the instructions told me to do. I had no real idea of what I was doing. Had I known what I was doing, then perhaps I would have completed it at a much faster pace." "I see." Relaxing her brows, Angelica proceeded to move towards where Jomnuk was. Standing next to him, she put her hand on the helmet and asked, "What should we do with him?" "Him, good question." Turning around and staring at Carl, I frowned. "Also, don't touch that. I don't know what that thing does." It was a fact that I couldn't kill him. If he died, then everyone would know that I wasn't the real Carl. After all, the demon that he was contracted with would definitely report back. That was part of why I didn't want Angelica to touch the helmet. If something happened to Carl, then everything would come crashing down. Okay. Fortunately, Angelica understood that. She removed her hand from the helmet. "Thanks." Thanking Angelica, I turned my attention back towards Carl. Could I use him to my advantage? I pondered. So far, the plan that I set up was perfect. At least, that's how it seemed to me. But I knew better than anyone else that no plan was ever perfect. Even if there were no apparent flaws in a plan, anything could ruin it at any time. There were too many unknown variables to account for, especially in my situation. Perhaps, due to some external factor, or even a minor miscalculation, the whole plan could crumble at any time. And that, I couldn't afford to have. Although I had a plan B, it wouldn't hurt to come up with a plan C. Pinching the middle of my brow, I spoke up after a while. "Leave him be for now. I'll figure something out while I'm at it." "Okay. Good." Turning my attention back towards the panel, I double-checked the values to make sure that nothing was wrong. Everything looks correct. None of the values seemed out of place. Here goes the second beacon. Once I checked and made sure that there were no errors, I pressed onto the final key. Ding.
Huh?
Done. Once I pressed on the keyboard and initiated the deactivation of the second beacon, leaning back on my chair, I closed my eyes for a brief moment. I wonder, just how much damage will the second beacon's loss do to the city defense? The first beacon's deactivation weakened the barrier considerably. Perhaps the second beacon would have a similar effect, if not worse. Opening my eyes, I then proceeded to tap on the panel. Before long, video images appeared in front of me and I took a look at the situation outside. At the same time, in Henneler's outer walls. The second beacon is down. A panicked scream echoed the hymn of despair in the hearts of all dwarves. Right as those words faded, one of the lights in the sky started to fade away before completely disappearing. Those who were standing below and witnessed the scene firsthand had horrified looks on their faces as they vividly watched the barrier once again lose color. It's the second beacon. Oh Almighty, what in the world is happening here? Crack. 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 But just as it looked like things couldn't get any worse, enormous cracks started to appear on the surface of the barrier. Before long, the cracks slowly started expanding all over the barrier's surface. Bang! Bang! As the cracks formed continuously, on the other side of the barrier, the demons attacked with greater ferocity. As they attacked, they had bloodthirsty, savage expressions on their faces. Bang! To those standing behind the barrier, it looked as though the attacks were working, as the earth shook and the blasts were no longer getting dispersed like they used to before. Even the barrier seemed to shake in the face of such an onslaught. Over here. Standing at the very bottom, right at the edge of the barrier, Hein glanced behind him and pointed towards a small crack forming on the surface. There's a crack forming over here. Quickly report this to Small Snake. Got it. Ava solemnly replied and took out a communication device from her dimensional space. With Small Snake and Ryan taking care of the logistics, they had asked her and the others to report to them whenever they saw a crack form on the barrier. As she was taking out her communication device, turning her head right towards Newton, she ordered, "Newton, go check if there are any more small cracks forming." Twite. Twirling, Newton flapped its wings and flew in the air. In a couple of seconds, it was already high up in the air, searching for any possible cracks on the shield. Good boy. Once Newton flew off her shoulder, Ava quickly sent a message to Small Snake and told him of her findings. There is a crack in the location that I'm currently in. So far, the crack looks small, but it appears as though it is increasing in size, although very slowly. I've sent you the coordinates already. Check it out when you have time. Click. Once she reported everything, turning off the communication device, Ava looked at Hein. We're done with this site. Let's go look for more cracks. Okay. Nodding, Hein left the area with Ava. This much damage with just the second beacon. For the barrier to weaken that much, just from 2 of its beacons not working, it seemed like my previous thoughts were correct. My plan had to be altered. Originally, I had expected this type of weakening from the 4th beacon's deactivation, not the 2nd. But for it to be damaged this much by just losing 2 beacons, something had gone terribly wrong with my plans and they needed to be changed. Not by much, but I now needed to operate at a faster pace. This is fucking annoying. I was of course annoyed by the development. I couldn't help but curse out loud. What happened? Angelica asked from the side. Turning to glance at her, I scratched the back of my head and sighed. Angelica, it looks like we have less time than I had expected. What do you mean by that? She asked, narrowing her eyes. Massaging my forehead, I replied in an exasperated tone, I mean that we are going to start moving either today or tomorrow. What? But, didn't you say that you needed a month? You're right, but things have changed. Just like Angelica said, the plan was originally going to span a month's period, just the right time to set everything up, but it looked like I was too naive. Taking out a small communication device, I sat back on my chair and texted Waylon and the others. With the dampener removed, I could now freely text whomever I wanted. I could also share my location with the others. In reality, I didn't really need the guys from the monolith to lure the others in here, but that wasn't my only goal. My goal in having the monolith lure the others here was simple. I wanted to make it seem as though they were the ones responsible for the whole mess. By doing so, I was trying to instigate conflict between Inferno and Monolith. Having 2 of the main demon-contracted organizations fight against each other, how sweet was that? Just thinking about it made me excited. Ren. Disrupting me out of my thoughts was Waylon's voice. Without even realizing it, Waylon had called me. I know. He sounded a little absent-minded. Most likely, he realized that our calculations were a little off. But he wasn't a veteran for nothing. In a matter of seconds, he recomposed himself and asked, "What do you suggest we do?" I think we have no choice but to speed things up. I see. A brief pause ensued. Looking at the panel displaying the situation outside, I asked, "How are things on your end? You holding up well? Last I heard, the monolith should have already made it in. Did they do as I suggested? Let's not talk about it. In fact, I'm quite relieved you're starting to move now. I think we underestimated the reaction of the dwarves regarding the sudden deaths of their comrades." "That bad?" Judging from his response, it seemed as though the monolith had already started making its move. "Yes. That bad. Damn." With the aid of Inferno, the members of Monolith infiltrated the city. The process was a smooth one. They were able to do it under the dwarves' noses. But the only reason why they made it in so easily was because of Waylon and Douglas. They gave them a little hand in secret. After that, following the words that I had said, the members of Monolith started killing a few dwarves here and there. Although their target was me, at the end of the day, Waylon and Douglas were also individuals that they wanted to get rid of. They had no qualms with what Inferno asked them to do. If not for Douglas, I'm not too sure how I wouldn't have been kicked out of this place. What about the others? How are they faring? With the perception of humans becoming more negative because of the deaths, I hoped the others didn't get affected by it too much. Fortunately, Waylon's next words relieved me a bit. Them? Their situation is a bit better. Since everyone's watched them fight with their life on the line, they are fairly respected. But I'm not sure how long that impression will last for. Nodding, I replied, "I understand. Keep an eye on the members of Monolith. As soon as they move, proceed as planned." "Wait, but are you going to be fine? The plan is proceeding way faster than anticipated. Will you be able to handle the changes?"
Yeah.
"Don't worry. Although it will be tough, I should be able to handle it," I reassured Waylon. Although things were more annoying now, I wasn't completely helpless. "Okay, if you say so," Waylon replied, his voice sounding a little bit less concerned. I guess the confidence in my speech helped him relax a little. "Good. I'll contact you again when I'm about to make a move. Message me when the monolith is going to make a move." "Got it." Turning off the communication device, I stood up and stared at the panel intently. Then, turning to face Angelica, I muttered, "I guess it's about time we start getting serious."